This week we begin studying a new book, the third of the 5 books of Moses. In Hebrew we call it Vayikra. In English it's called the Book of Leviticus. The majority of this book is teaching us about sacrifices and offerings to God. Right at the beginning, when God commands Moshe to teach the Jewish people that they must bring sacrifices and offerings to God, we know, as the Torah is about to share the details over the next few weeks, that there are several categories of offerings. There is one that's obligatory. There is one category that includes voluntary. There is one category of thankful offerings. There are communal offerings. There are offerings for a holiday. For example, in 2 weeks we'll be celebrating Passover. Passover is very famous for the Paschal offering. It's actually the first offering that the Jewish people as a nation brought while in Egypt already. And so there are many other details to the sacrifices. One of the questions that people ask is, what's the purpose of the sacrifices? Of course, it must be prefaced that sacrifices or animal sacrifices does not entail any animal cruelty at all. In fact, Judaism is very sensitive to the pain of animals, and we have very clear instructions and commandments about caring for animals. The sacrifices that are brought on the altar in the temple first must be slaughtered in a very, very strict way that causes no pain to the animal, and only then it can be brought up on the altar as a sacrifice. So it must be prefaced that there is no animal cruelty or animal pain that's caused in the process. But many people through the ages have asked, what's the purpose? What's the goal? Why are we doing it? In addition to it, immediately when God teaches us about the sacrifices, He adds the following words: Reach nichoach laHashem, a pleasant aroma before God. It is very unusual that God is commanding us to follow a certain way or do something, and He immediately tells us it will bring a pleasant aroma or bring great pleasure to God. Why is this that here, when it comes to sacrifices, aside from the fact that we don't even know the reason, that it also adds great pleasure to God? So here are some of the explanations as to the reason for sacrifices. Maimonides, Rambam, in his commentary and the book for the perplexed, explains that the Jewish people living in Egypt were so immersed in idol worshipping and animal sacrifices because the Egyptians had always lived with bringing sacrifices to their gods, and therefore God needed to veer them off of idol worshipping, and therefore He gave them the commandment to bring sacrifices to God. However, this explanation is being debated and questioned by many commentators. For one reason, we know that Noah, who lived centuries before the Jewish people lived in Egypt, brought an offering to God when he left the ark, and we are told that it brought great pleasure to God. And there are many other questions. Nachmanides, who lived not long after Maimonides, explains that when a man sins, he gets all his faculties, all his powers involved in the sin, and that includes action, his hands or feet involved in the action of the sin, speech, he usually is talking about it, and thought, he is contemplating committing the sin and thinking how to best benefit from the behavior. And there is one mitzvah that comes to atone for sin, sacrifices, which includes all three acts, all three faculties, because when one brings sacrifice, it's unique in the obligations that not only the action, the purchasing of the animal, expenditure, and that involve action, he also needs to confess in speech, and finally his thought, he must have in mind that he's doing it for God's sake, to ask for forgiveness. So therefore, asking forgiveness or repentance for sin must involve all three faculties, and it's done through the sacrifices. The Rebbe points out that that involves only sin offerings, offerings that are supposed to atone for sins. What about the voluntary offerings? What about communal offerings and holiday offerings and thankful offerings? Says the Rebbe that according to Rashi, as Rashi is hinting to, Rashi tells us that offerings and sacrifices categorically do not have a reason. And the only reason God commanded us is because He wants us to follow His instructions when there is no benefit to us or God whatsoever. In other words, the uniqueness of sacrifices is that it does not serve any purpose, and there is no way to explain it or rationalize it in our mind, because it doesn't make sense. And even God Himself will not be able to explain us the reason, because it really does not make sense. But when a man is following the instruction, God's order, and brings sacrifices, he demonstrates that he follows God not only when it makes sense, but even if it doesn't make sense and it does not benefit God or humanity. And that's why Rashi says the great pleasure is attached to the commandments of the sacrifices. Because when one follows God's commandments in the sacrifices and the offerings, he does bring great pleasure to God, because he demonstrates his very strong bond with God, willing to go through the expense and the hardship of doing something that makes no sense and will bring no benefit to us as human beings or to God. Therefore, says the Rebbe, this explanation goes across the board for all categories of sacrifices, and that's the reason it is the only commandment in which God tells us great pleasure and aroma before God. Unfortunately, in this day and age, there is no temple, there is no holy temple, and there is no sacrifices. We are forbidden from bringing offerings as animal sacrifices. It is very strict that the law does not allow us to bring any. However, we can bring offerings to God in a spiritual sense, where we dedicate part of our day or part of our resources and energy to God and say, here it is, for God's sake, let's spend time teaching or studying Torah, let's give resources to tzedakah, let's dedicate a day of the week for God, Shabbat, or an hour or a couple of minutes, spend and socialize with people for the sake of God, which is a selfless act. This is a type of offerings and sacrifices that can be achieved in our day and age. I want to wish you all a blessed and healthy week, and may we all only share good news. Thank you.